May 11th, 1945. 30 miles northwest of Okinawa. Lieutenant Yoshiro Kato pushed his Zero fighter into a steep dive toward the American destroyer below, its grey hull cutting white foam through the dark Pacific waters. He had volunteered for this mission, knowing he would not return, had written his final letters home, had drunk the ceremonial sake with his squadron mates at dawn. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But nothing in his training, nothing in the sacred rituals of the Tokubetsu Kogekitai, the special attack units, had prepared him for what happened next. The sky around his aircraft erupted, not with the familiar black puffs of timed anti-aircraft fire that exploded at predetermined altitudes, giving pilots precious seconds to maneuver between the bursts. These shells detonated the instant they came near him, creating an impenetrable wall of shrapnel that seemed to track his every movement. His Zero shuddered as fragments tore through the wings. The engine coughed, belched smoke. He was still 2,000 feet from his target when a shell exploded directly beside his cockpit, so close he could feel the heat through the canopy glass. Kato never reached the destroyer. His aircraft disintegrated in mid-air, joining 11 other kamikazes shot down that morning by a weapon the Japanese High Command could not understand and could not counter. The Americans called it the VT Fuze, variable time, a deliberately misleading name designed to hide its true nature. But to the Japanese pilots who faced it, to the naval officers who watched attack after attack fail against ships that should have been overwhelmed, it was simply impossible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Mathematics of aerial warfare in 1945 had shifted so dramatically that Japanese commanders struggled to accept the evidence accumulating in their after-action reports. Before the Americans deployed their new Fuze, conventional anti-aircraft fire required approximately 2,000 shells to down a single aircraft. The gunners had to predict where the aircraft would be several seconds in the future, set mechanical timers on each shell to explode at that precise altitude, and fire. If the prediction was wrong by even a few hundred feet, if the timing was off by a fraction of a second, the shell would explode harmlessly. Japanese pilots had learned to exploit this weakness. They would vary their altitude unpredictably, jinking and weaving through the black clouds of timed bursts. Experienced pilots could survive dozens of missions against conventional anti-aircraft fire. The survival rate was poor, certainly, but it was survivable. Then, in January 1943, something changed. The light cruiser USS Helena, operating off Guadalcanal, fired 3 salvos at departing Japanese dive bombers. The aircraft were maneuvering, difficult targets at extreme range. Helena's gunners had mere seconds to engage. Under normal circumstances, the probability of a hit approached 0. All 3 shells exploded near one of the Val dive bombers. The aircraft, struck by shrapnel from multiple directions simultaneously, plunged burning into the sea. The Helena's gun crews celebrated what appeared to be extraordinary luck. But it was not luck. It was American industrial capacity made manifest in a device so sophisticated that even America's own allies did not initially believe it could work. The story of how this weapon came to dominate the Pacific skies began not in combat, but in the laboratories of Johns Hopkins University, where in the summer of 1940, a team of physicists confronted what every major power had concluded was an impossible problem. The National Defense Research Committee, formed on June 27, 1940, brought together America's leading scientists under the direction of Vannevar Bush. Their mandate was simple to state, but seemingly impossible to achieve. Create a fuse that would detonate an artillery shell automatically when it approached an enemy aircraft, without requiring gunners to predict the target's position or set mechanical timers. The concept was elegant. If a shell could detect when it was near a target and detonate itself at that precise moment, it would transform near misses into kills. The practical engineering challenges were staggering. Consider what such a device required. It had to fit inside the nose of a 5-inch artillery shell, leaving room for 7 pounds of high explosive. It had to contain a complete radio transmitter and receiver, capable of detecting reflected radio waves using the Doppler effect. It had to generate its own electrical power. It had to remain stable during months of storage in tropical heat and Arctic cold. Most impossibly of all, it had to survive being fired from a gun. When a 5-inch shell is fired, it accelerates from 0 to 2,600 feet per second in roughly 20 feet of gun barrel. This creates a force of 20,000 times Earth's gravity, a crushing acceleration that would instantly pulverize any normal electronic component. The shell then spins at 25,000 revolutions per minute as it travels through the rifled barrel, and after surviving this violence, the delicate electronics inside had to function perfectly for the few seconds of flight time before reaching the target. German engineers had been working on proximity fuses since 1930. By 1939, they had developed more than 30 different designs, using acoustic sensors triggered by engine noise, electrostatic detectors responding to charged aircraft surfaces, and experimental radio systems. Every approach failed. The Reich concluded that miniaturized electronics capable of surviving artillery acceleration were theoretically impossible, and in 1940, Hitler's staff issued directives prioritizing only weapons that could reach production within 6 months. Germany's proximity fuse programs were cancelled. The British reached further. Researchers at the Telecommunications Research Establishment conceived of using miniature Doppler radar. They built prototypes and tested them on unguided rockets, which faced far less severe acceleration than gun-fired shells. But Britain's program stalled on 2 insurmountable obstacles. The cost was astronomical, and Britain's industrial capacity was already stretched to breaking. More fundamentally, they could not solve the miniaturization problem. The smallest vacuum tubes available, those used in hearing aids, were still too fragile to survive the shock of being fired from a gun. By 1941, British scientists had working prototypes that functioned perhaps 50% of the time under ideal conditions. For military use, this was inadequate. The British shared their research with America through the Tizard mission. It would be American scientists and American industry that actually made it work. Section T of the Applied Physics Laboratory, established on March 10, 1942, in a rented Chevrolet garage in Silver Spring, Maryland, settled on a radio-based design. A miniature transmitter in the shell's nose would emit radio waves at approximately 180 to 220 MHz. When these waves reflected off a target and returned to the shell, the frequency would shift due to the Doppler effect. When this frequency reached a predetermined value, indicating lethal range, an electrical circuit would close and detonate the shell. The theory was straightforward. The engineering was another matter entirely. James Van Allen, a young physicist who joined the laboratory in April 1942, faced the task of developing what the team called rugged vacuum tubes. He started with miniature tubes that Raytheon and Sylvania had developed for hearing aids, devices designed for the gentle environment of sitting in someone's pocket, not the violence of artillery fire. Working with Sylvania Company engineers, Van Allen redesigned the tubes from first principles. The glass envelopes were thickened and carefully annealed. The internal filaments and grids were redesigned with shorter spans and heavier cross-sections. The tubes were potted in wax inside the fuse body, cushioning them against shock. Every design iteration was tested by firing complete fuses from a vertical gun into the ground at the Naval Proving Ground in Dahlgren, Virginia. The soft earth caught the shells gently enough that researchers could recover the fuses and examine the tubes under microscopes to see precisely what had broken. Through hundreds of test firings and thousands of design modifications, the team gradually developed tubes that could survive. By September 1941, they were achieving success rates above 50%. The Navy, desperate for any improvement in anti-aircraft effectiveness, accepted this failure rate and authorized mass production tooling. The engineers were confident they could improve reliability during the production ramp-up. They were right. By early 1943, reliability had climbed above 90%, but vacuum tubes were only one challenge among many. The fuse needed a power source. Conventional batteries were too large and had limited shelf life, particularly in tropical heat. Engineers developed a reserve battery using liquid electrolyte kept separate from battery plates until activation. When the shell was fired, centrifugal force spun the electrolyte into contact with the plates, generating electricity. This gave the batteries indefinite storage life. The fuse needed multiple safety mechanisms. It could not arm until well clear of the gun. It required protection against accidental detonation from radio interference or the ship's own radar. It needed circuitry to prevent premature detonation when fired at low angles over water, where radio waves reflecting off the ocean surface might trigger a false positive. Each safety feature added complexity. By the time development was complete, each proximity fuse contained approximately 130 miniaturized electronic components. The Mark 32 fuse for the Navy's 5-inch gun measured 8 inches long and weighed just over 2 pounds. Inside its steel casing was perhaps the most sophisticated piece of miniaturized electronics that existed in 1942. On August 12, 1942, the light cruiser USS Cleveland conducted the first operational test in Chesapeake Bay. The targets were 3 radio-controlled drone aircraft. Using conventional ammunition, downing these maneuvering drones typically required dozens of shots. Cleveland's gunners, firing proximity-fused shells, destroyed all 3 drones with just 4 bursts on the first day of testing. The Navy immediately cancelled the remainder of scheduled tests and ordered mass production to begin. 5 companies were selected to manufacture the fuses: Crosley Corporation, Radio Corporation of America, Eastman Kodak, General Electric, and McQuay Norris. Production started slowly. By the end of 1942, factories were producing 500 fuses per day, but American industrial capacity was just warming up. By late 1943, production had reached 40,000 fuses per day. Over the course of the war, American industry would produce more than 22 million proximity fuses at a cost exceeding $1 billion 1940s dollars. More than 100 factories participated in some phase of production. The Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati alone produced 5,259,113 fuses, representing 24% of total production. The company employed 10,000 workers operating continuously, 7 days a week, achieving peak output of 16,500 fuses daily. Sylvania Electric Products in Ipswich, Massachusetts produced even more, manufacturing 5,683,332 fuses, while also producing 95% of all miniature vacuum tubes used across the program. Thousands of workers, many of them women, assembled the intricate components under conditions of absolute secrecy. Workers signed secrecy oaths and were searched entering and leaving the facilities. They did not know what they were building. Many worked with microscopes, assembling electronic components so small that a single error could render the fuse useless. Security surrounding the proximity fuse was second only to the Manhattan Project. The device was given the deliberately misleading code name VT Fuse, supposedly standing for variable time, to disguise its true nature as a radio proximity detector. The very existence of the fuse was classified. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Even its use in combat was initially restricted to situations where there was no chance of a dud falling into enemy hands. The first combat use would occur only over open ocean, where any unexploded shells would sink beyond enemy reach. The first combat use came on January 5, 1943, off Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. 4 Japanese Aichi D-3 dive bombers, Allied reporting name VAL, attacked a U.S. Navy task force. The VALs were obsolete aircraft, slow and vulnerable, but they remained dangerous due to their accuracy and the skill of their pilots. One VAL scored a hit on the New Zealand light cruiser Achilles before the group broke off their attack. As the aircraft departed, Lieutenant Commander Red Cochran, commanding the aft 5-inch battery on the cruiser USS Helena, fired 3 salvos of proximity-fused shells at the distant bombers. Helena's gunners had mere seconds to engage. The targets were maneuvering, pulling away at maximum speed. Under normal circumstances, the probability of success would have been minimal. Conventional shells would have required precise range estimation and perfect timing. All 3 shells exploded near one of the Val dive bombers. The aircraft, struck by shrapnel from the airbursts, shredded. It plunged into the sea. Helena's gunners had achieved what would have required dozens of conventional shells. They had downed an enemy aircraft without scoring a direct hit. Word of the success spread rapidly through the Pacific Fleet. By mid-1943, substantial quantities of proximity-fused ammunition were being shipped to Pearl Harbor. Combat results exceeded every prediction. In 1943, proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire was credited with more than half of all Japanese aircraft downed by naval gunfire, despite proximity fuses being used in only 25% of shells fired. The implications were stark. The fuses were roughly 300% more effective than conventional ammunition. A shell equipped with a proximity fuse was worth 3 to 4 conventional shells in terms of target effect. Admiral R. Lee Burke, later Chief of Naval Operations, recalled that when he served as Chief of Staff to Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding the fast carrier task forces, proximity fuses knocked down enemy planes by the dozens. The weapon was changing the calculus of naval warfare in ways that Japanese commanders were only beginning to comprehend. But the true test of the proximity fuse's effectiveness would not come until the Japanese, facing catastrophic losses of experienced pilots and the collapse of their carrier fleet, adopted a tactic so desperate, so psychologically devastating, that it would challenge every assumption about aerial warfare. They would turn their pilots into guided missiles. They would create the kamikaze. The decision to implement systematic suicide attacks came in October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commander of the 1st Air Fleet, faced an impossible situation. His forces had fewer than 100 operational aircraft to oppose the massive American invasion fleet off the Philippines. His pilots were increasingly inexperienced, many with only minimal flight training. Conventional attacks had become almost futile. American combat air patrols, radar-directed fighters, and dense anti-aircraft fire meant that Japanese strike aircraft rarely reached their targets. And even when they did, bombing and torpedo accuracy had fallen to single-digit percentages. Onishi proposed a solution that violated every principle of military aviation and every cultural norm of Tig-To's Japanese society, despite later propaganda claiming otherwise. He would organize units of pilots who would deliberately crash their aircraft into enemy ships, turning the plane itself into a guided bomb. The first organized kamikaze attack occurred on October 25, 1944. 5 Zero fighters, each carrying a single 250-kilogram bomb, dove on American escort carriers off Samar. 4 of the 5 scored hits. The escort carrier USS St. Lo sank. Several other carriers were heavily damaged. The success rate was extraordinary. Conventional attacks might require dozens of sorties to achieve a single hit. These 5 pilots had achieved an 80% hit rate, though at the cost of their lives. Japanese Naval Command recognized the tactical effectiveness immediately. The problem of pilot skill and aircraft losses vanished if the pilot guided the weapon all the way to impact. A barely trained pilot in a deteriorating aircraft could potentially sink a major warship if he was willing to die in the attempt. Orders went out across Japanese aviation units. The Toko-Tai, Special Attack Forces, would be expanded. Hundreds of pilots volunteered, motivated by a complex mixture of genuine patriotism, social pressure, and the grim knowledge that their chances of surviving conventional missions were already minimal. But the Japanese High Command made their decision based on combat data from autumn 1944, before the proximity fuse had been widely deployed against aircraft. They were calculating effectiveness based on an anti-aircraft environment that was about to change fundamentally. By January 1945, American warships were receiving proximity-fused ammunition in unlimited quantities. Every major vessel in the Pacific Fleet had magazines stocked with VT rounds, and the kamikaze attacks were providing the perfect target profile for proximity fuses to demonstrate their lethality. Unlike conventional bombers that might release weapons and turn away, kamikaze pilots had to maintain a steady dive directly toward their target. They had to hold course through the anti-aircraft fire, had to keep the ship in their sights all the way to impact. They could not evade, they could not maneuver defensively. This made them ideal targets for proximity-fused shells. The true effectiveness of VT fuses against kamikazes became apparent during the invasion of Okinawa, beginning on April 1, 1945. The Japanese launched Operation Tengo, their most concentrated aerial offensive of the war. The plan called for 10,000 aircraft, half of them kamikazes, organized into massive attacks called kikusui, floating chrysanthemums. The first kikusui raid occurred on April 6th and 7th. 355 kamikaze aircraft, supported by hundreds of conventional attackers and escorts, struck at the American invasion fleet. The sky filled with aircraft diving through clouds, their targets the hundreds of ships supporting the largest amphibious operation in the Pacific War. The American response was devastating. Destroyers on radar picket duty, positioned to provide early warning of incoming raids, found themselves under continuous attack. These vessels bore the brunt of the kamikaze offensive, engaging aircraft at close range with every weapon available. The USS Laffey, a Fletcher-class destroyer on Picket Station 1, came under attack by 22 aircraft over an 80-minute period. The crew fought with a ferocity that would earn the ship the nickname, the ship that would not die. Laffey's 5-inch guns, firing proximity-fused shells, created a lethal barrier around the ship. The shells exploded whenever they approached an aircraft, creating overlapping zones of shrapnel that made approach extremely difficult. 4 kamikazes and 4 bombs hit the destroyer, but Laffey shot down 9 attacking aircraft and damaged several others. Significant casualties and damage. But the engagement demonstrated both the effectiveness of proximity fuses and the limitations of even the most advanced weapons. The problem was timing. Kamikaze aircraft approaching at high speed gave gunners only seconds to engage. The 5-inch guns, despite their long range and devastating effectiveness when they could track targets, required time to acquire, track, and engage fast-moving aircraft diving from multiple directions. The proximity fuses eliminated the need to set timers or predict future positions. The shells would explode automatically when they sensed a target, but they still required the guns to point in approximately the correct direction. Against mass attacks by aircraft willing to die, even perfect weapons had limitations. The statistics from the Okinawa campaign revealed the true picture. Between April and June 1945, Japanese forces launched approximately 1,900 kamikaze sorties against the invasion fleet. American anti-aircraft fire destroyed approximately 64% of these aircraft before they could strike their targets. Of 793 kamikazes that actually attacked ships, 181 achieved hits, a 23% success rate. Another 95 achieved near misses close enough to cause damage. 517 missed completely. This meant that 77% of kamikaze aircraft that reached the fleet failed to cause significant damage. This failure rate was directly attributable to American anti-aircraft fire, with proximity fuses playing a decisive role. Analysis of specific engagements showed that 5-inch guns firing VT-fused ammunition were credited with 44% of all kamikaze shoot-downs by anti-aircraft artillery, despite the guns being designed primarily for long-range engagement rather than close-in defense. The impact on Japanese forces was psychological as much as material. Kamikaze pilots, briefed on their targets and their approach routes, understood intellectually that they would face anti-aircraft fire, but understanding and experiencing were vastly different. Lieutenant Sei Ishikawa, flying his Zero toward the American fleet on April 12, 1945, watched the sky around his formation erupt into fire. The Americans were shooting at them from distances that should have been impossible to judge accurately. Shells exploded precisely at the altitude his squadron was flying, creating a barrier of shrapnel that seemed to anticipate their every movement. Ishikawa watched 3 aircraft from his formation disintegrate before they came within 5 miles of the fleet. He pushed his Zero into a steeper dive, trying to build speed, trying to make himself a more difficult target. A shell exploded 20 feet from his right wing. Shrapnel punched through the thin aluminum skin. The Zero shuddered. Oil streamed from the cowling. The engine began losing power. Ishikawa never reached his target. His aircraft crashed into the sea 2,000 yards short of the nearest destroyer. This pattern repeated across hundreds of engagements. Japanese pilots, expecting to trade their lives for American ships, found themselves shot down before they could complete their final mission. The propaganda films, shown to Tokotai volunteers, had depicted pilots diving through anti-aircraft fire, striking their targets in glorious final moments of service to the Emperor. The reality was, shells that exploded the instant they approached, creating kill zones that made successful attacks increasingly improbable. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By May 1945, Japanese Naval Aviation Command began receiving reports that troubled them deeply. The reports came from observation posts on islands around Okinawa, from surviving pilots of conventional attacks who witnessed kamikaze operations, from radio intercepts of American communications. The Americans had developed a new type of anti-aircraft shell. The shells did not explode at predetermined times. They did not require direct hits. They exploded automatically when aircraft approached, with a precision that seemed almost impossible. Captain Rikihei Inaguchi, serving on the staff of Vice Admiral Ugaki, commander of 5th Air Fleet, reviewed the combat reports with growing concern. The statistics were undeniable. Kamikaze success rates, which had exceeded 40% during the Philippines campaign in autumn 1944, had fallen below 25% at Okinawa. This decline could not be explained by improved fighter interception alone. American fighters could not be everywhere simultaneously, yet kamikaze aircraft were being shot down with remarkable consistency, even when they approached targets without fighter opposition. The anti-aircraft fire itself had changed character. Pilots reported shells that seemed to track them, that exploded at exactly the wrong moment regardless of altitude changes or evasive maneuvers. Inaguchi understood the implications. The Americans had solved a problem that Japanese scientists had concluded was unsolvable. They had created a fuse that could detect approaching aircraft and detonate automatically at optimal range. The question was how they had done it, and whether Japanese industry could duplicate the technology. On May 11, 1945, a day that would stand as one of the worst in the Okinawa campaign, the true effectiveness of American proximity fuses would be demonstrated against the largest concentration of kamikaze attacks yet witnessed. The 6th Kikusui Raid, Operation Floating Chrysanthemum No. 6, launched 165 kamikaze aircraft and 150 conventional attackers. Their targets included the Fast Carrier Task Force, the most valuable assets in the American fleet. The destroyer USS Hugh W. Hadley and destroyer escort USS Evans, positioned on radar picket duty at Station 15, detected the incoming raid. The two ships, along with 4 landing craft equipped with anti-aircraft guns, prepared to face overwhelming odds. What followed would become one of the most intense anti-aircraft actions of the Pacific War and a decisive demonstration of proximity, fuse effectiveness, against massed kamikaze attack. The engagement began at 8:45 in the morning. The first wave of aircraft appeared on radar at 20 miles. Within minutes, the sky filled with Japanese planes, approximately 150 aircraft targeting the small group of American vessels. Hadley's 5-inch guns opened fire at maximum range, using proximity-fused shells. The first shells created airburst eats 7 miles from the ship, far beyond the effective range of timed fuses. Aircraft began falling from the sky before they could organize their attacks. Over the next 90 minutes, Hadley and Evans engaged wave after wave of attacking aircraft. The destroyer's 5-inch guns fired continuously, creating a defensive zone around the ships where proximity-fused shells exploded whenever aircraft approached. The statistics from this engagement would be carefully analyzed by American naval intelligence. Hadley knocked down 23 enemy aircraft before being hit by 1 bomb, 3 kamikazes, and 1 Oka rocket bomb. Evans accounted for additional aircraft before being struck 4 times by suicide planes. Both ships survived, though with catastrophic damage. But the analysis focused on something else. Of approximately 150 aircraft that attacked this small force, Over 30 were shot down by the two destroyers alone, the majority by 5-inch guns firing proximity-fused ammunition. This represented a kill rate far exceeding what would have been possible with conventional ammunition. Post-war analysis estimated that without proximity fuses, perhaps 5 to 8 aircraft might have been downed. With VT-fused ammunition, the kill rate exceeded 30. The Bureau of Ordnance report on this action concluded that proximity-fused ammunition had been indispensable. Without it, the two destroyers would almost certainly have been overwhelmed and sunk early in the engagement. This assessment would be repeated across dozens of similar actions during the Okinawa campaign. Proximity fuses had not made kamikaze attacks harmless. Ships continued to be hit, sailors continued to die. But the fuses had made mass kamikaze attacks sustainable for American forces where they might otherwise have been overwhelming. For Japanese aviation commanders, the implications were devastating. The 6th Kikusui attack on May 11th cost the Japanese 165 kamikaze aircraft and achieved hits on only a handful of ships, none of which sank. The mathematics were brutal. Japan was expending irreplaceable pilots and aircraft at a rate that could not be sustained, while achieving results that could not alter the strategic situation. But the full picture was worse than Japanese commanders realized. They understood that American anti-aircraft fire had become devastatingly effective. What they did not understand was why. Japanese naval intelligence had been monitoring American radio communications since the first proximity-fused shells were used in combat. Intercepts revealed references to something called VT ammunition or posit fuses, terms that meant nothing to Japanese cryptanalysts. Some intelligence officers theorized that VT stood for variable time, suggesting an improved mechanical timer that could be adjusted during flight. This seemed plausible, but did not explain the precision with which shells detonated near aircraft. Others suggested the Americans had developed some form of optical sensor, perhaps using photoelectric cells to detect aircraft and trigger detonation. This theory had the advantage of explaining the automatic detonation, but raised questions about how such delicate sensors could survive being fired from a gun. No one in Japanese intelligence seriously considered that the Americans had placed complete radio transmitters and receivers inside artillery shells. The engineering challenges seemed insurmountable. The acceleration forces alone should have destroyed any vacuum tubes. The power requirements for a radio transmitter should have required batteries too large to fit in a shell. The complexity of the circuitry should have made mass production impossible, yet the evidence continued to accumulate. American ships were shooting down aircraft with a consistency that could not be explained by improved gunnery training or better fire control systems alone. Something fundamental had changed about American anti-aircraft ammunition. In June 1945, Japanese Naval Technical Command assembled a team of engineers to analyze the problem. The team included specialists in radio technology, explosives, and fire control systems. Their mandate was simple: determine what the Americans had done to make their anti-aircraft fire so effective and assess whether Japan could duplicate it. The team began with the assumption that American shells contained some form of proximity sensor. The question was, what type? They analyzed combat reports, looking for patterns that might reveal the sensor's operating principles. Acoustic sensors could be ruled out immediately. The noise of the shell traveling through the air at supersonic speeds would drown out any aircraft engine sounds. Optical sensors seemed unlikely given the need to function in darkness, clouds, and poor weather. Magnetic sensors would not work against non-ferrous aircraft. This left radio-based sensors as the most plausible explanation. But Japanese engineers who worked in radio technology understood the challenges. A radio transmitter small enough to fit in an artillery shell would require miniaturized vacuum tubes, far smaller than anything currently in production. Such tubes would need to survive acceleration forces of 20,000 times gravity. The entire system would need to generate its own power, detect reflected radio waves, analyze the frequency shift caused by the Doppler effect, and trigger detonation, all within the few seconds of flight time. The technical consensus was that while such a device was theoretically possible, it would require manufacturing capabilities and quality control far beyond what Japanese industry could achieve under wartime conditions. Even if the Americans had somehow built such a device, duplicating it would require years of development and massive industrial investment. The conclusion reached by the technical team was profoundly discouraging. America had developed a weapon that Japan could not duplicate and, more significantly, could not counter. There were, theoretically, countermeasures that might work against radio proximity fuses. Electronic jamming could potentially interfere with the radio signals, preventing the fuses from detecting reflected waves. But effective jamming would require knowing the exact frequency the fuses operated on and deploying jamming equipment aboard every potential target aircraft. Japan possessed neither the intercepted fuses necessary to determine operating frequencies, nor the industrial capacity to produce jamming equipment in quantity, nor the time to develop and deploy such systems before the war reached its inevitable conclusion. The only practical countermeasure was tactical. Pilots could attempt to approach targets at extremely low altitude, where the proximity fuses might detonate prematurely due to reflections from the ocean surface. This tactic had limitations. Low-altitude approaches were vulnerable to shorter-range anti-aircraft weapons, gave pilots less time to correct their aim, and did not eliminate the proximity fuse threat entirely. By July 1945, the Kamikaze campaign had effectively ended. Not because Japan lacked aircraft or pilots willing to fly suicide missions, but because the losses had become unsustainable even by the brutal calculations of Toko-Tai operations. Between October 1944 and August 1945, Japan expended approximately 4,000 kamikaze sorties across all theaters of operation. These attacks sank approximately 47 Allied ships and damaged several hundred others. The casualties inflicted were significant, roughly 12,000 Allied sailors killed or wounded. But Japan had sacrificed nearly 4,000 pilots and aircraft to achieve these results. The exchange ratio was unsustainable, and more critically, the kamikaze attacks had failed to achieve their strategic objective. The invasion of Okinawa succeeded despite the kamikazes. The American fleet remained operational, the amphibious forces secured the island, and American forces now stood poised to invade the Japanese home islands. What Japanese commanders did not know, could not know, was that the proximity fuse had played a decisive role in making this possible. Post-war analysis by American naval historians estimated that without proximity fuses, American casualties at Okinawa would have increased by approximately 50%. Ship losses might have doubled or tripled. The psychological impact of sustaining such casualties could potentially have delayed the invasion schedule, giving Japan additional time to prepare defenses. Admiral William Halsey, commander of Third Fleet, stated after the war that proximity fuses had been decisive in defeating kamikaze attacks. He noted that during the early kamikaze attacks in the Philippines, before VT fuses were widely distributed, American ships struggled to cope with suicide attacks. By Okinawa, with proximity fuses available in quantity, the fleet could sustain operations despite intensive kamikaze campaigns. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal put it more directly. He stated that the proximity fuse helped blaze the trail to Japan. Without the protection this device gave surface ships, he said, the westward push could not have been so swift, and the cost in men and ships would have been immeasurably greater. The mathematics supported this assessment. Analysis of combat data showed that proximity-fused shells were approximately 6 times more effective than conventional ammunition against aircraft. In practical terms, this meant American warships could engage 6 times as many aircraft with the same ammunition expenditure, or achieve the same number of kills with 1/6 the ammunition. This force multiplier was decisive. It allowed American forces to sustain operations in the face of kamikaze attacks that might otherwise have been prohibitively costly. But there was another dimension to the proximity fuse's impact that went beyond simple statistics. The weapon had psychological effects, on both sides, that shaped the final months of the Pacific War. For American sailors, the proximity fuse provided tangible reassurance. Crew members watched shells explode near attacking aircraft, saw planes fall from the sky before they could reach the ship. The fuse did not make ships invulnerable, but it made survival seem possible. This psychological factor was crucial in maintaining morale during the intense combat off Okinawa. For Japanese pilots, the experience was opposite. Toko-Tai volunteers understood they were making one-way trips, but they expected to reach their targets, expected their deaths to have meaning and purpose. Instead, many were shot down miles from their objectives, their sacrifices achieving nothing. Surviving pilots from conventional attacks, who witnessed kamikaze operations, reported that the most psychologically devastating aspect was the futility. Pilots died without even seeing their targets clearly, destroyed by shells that seemed to explode at exactly the worst possible moment. This sense of futility began to affect volunteer rates. By summer 1945, Japanese aviation units were finding it increasingly difficult to fill Toko-Tai rosters. The early volunteers had been motivated by a mixture of genuine patriotism and martial spirit. Later volunteers faced a different calculation. They would almost certainly die, and increasingly likely die without accomplishing anything meaningful. The Kamikaze campaign, which had begun with such dramatic success in October 1944, effectively ended in July 1945, not because Japan ran out of aircraft or pilots, but because the tactic had been rendered ineffective by American technology. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 brought the war to its conclusion before the planned invasion of Japan. The world would never see Operation Downfall, the massive amphibious assault on the Japanese home islands that American forces had been preparing. But planning documents for Operation Downfall revealed the role proximity fuses were expected to play. American planners anticipated kamikaze attacks of unprecedented scale during the invasion. Intelligence estimates suggested Japan had reserved approximately 7,000 aircraft for homeland defense, with the majority designated for suicide missions. American naval forces preparing for the invasion were equipped with proximity-fused ammunition in quantities that dwarfed anything used at Okinawa. Every vessel in the invasion fleet, from battleships to landing craft, carried VT-fused rounds. Fire control plans anticipated creating overlapping zones of proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire that would make kamikaze attacks almost suicidal in their futility. The grim irony was that kamikaze attacks were inherently suicidal. But American planners intended to ensure they were suicidal without being effective, that Japanese pilots would die in overwhelming numbers without achieving significant ship losses. The war ended before this could be tested, but the planning documents revealed American confidence that proximity fuses had fundamentally altered the balance of power in naval aviation combat. In the aftermath of Japan's surrender, American occupation forces discovered extensive documentation of Japanese proximity fuse research. The files revealed that Japanese scientists had indeed understood the theoretical principles behind radio proximity fuses. They had even conducted limited experiments with similar technologies. What stopped Japanese development was not lack of understanding, but lack of capability. The industrial infrastructure required to mass-produce miniaturized vacuum tubes did not exist in Japan. The quality control systems necessary to ensure 90% reliability did not exist. The testing facilities needed to verify performance did not exist. Most critically, the economic resources required to develop and produce such a weapon did not exist. Japan's war economy in 1944 and 1945 was collapsing. Industrial production was declining, strategic materials were increasingly scarce. Under these conditions, investing in a weapon system as complex and expensive as proximity fuses was impossible. American engineers examining Japanese research facilities after the surrender found evidence of sophisticated theoretical work. Japanese physicists understood Doppler radar principles. They understood the challenges of miniaturization and ruggedization. They had even built prototype proximity fuses for rockets and missiles. But they had never successfully built a proximity fuse for artillery that worked reliably enough for combat use. The gap between theoretical understanding and practical implementation proved insurmountable. This gap represented something larger than a single weapons system. It represented the fundamental difference in industrial capacity between America and Japan. America in 1945 was the world's largest industrial economy, untouched by strategic bombing, with access to virtually unlimited raw materials and energy. American industry could invest over $1 billion in a single weapon system, could dedicate over 100 factories to producing a device containing 130 miniaturized components, could employ tens of thousands of workers in quality control and testing. Japan could not match this. Japan's industrial base was small by comparison, increasingly devastated by American bombing, cut off from raw materials by submarine blockade and naval defeat. Japanese industry could not spare resources for speculative weapons development when it struggled to produce basic ammunition and aircraft. The proximity Fuze story was, in microcosm, the story of why Japan lost the Pacific War, not because of inferior technology or lack of scientific understanding, but because of overwhelming disparity in industrial capacity, resources. A Japanese engineer interviewed after the war captured this understanding with striking clarity. He stated that the proximity fuse demonstrated what Americans could achieve when they applied unlimited resources to solving difficult problems. Japanese engineers, he said, understood the theory, but theory was useless without the industrial infrastructure to implement it. The Kamikaze campaign represented Japan's attempt to offset American material superiority with Japanese willingness to sacrifice. The proximity fuse represented America's response, a technological solution that made Japanese sacrifice ineffective. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.